The small metal pod screamed through the atmosphere of Haven's Edge like a falling star. Inside, Zarakai fought to keep control as warning lights flashed red all around her. Her silver-blue hands gripped the controls tightly as the ground rushed up to meet her. The impact was violent. Trees snapped like twigs as the pod carved a deep scar through the forest floor. Metal screamed against rock and dirt before everything went silent, except for the hiss of escaping air and the crackle of small fires. Zarakai's head pounded as she slowly opened her large, luminous eyes. Blood ran down her face from a cut on her forehead. Her left arm hung at a wrong angle, sending waves of pain through her tall, graceful body every time she moved. Something was broken inside her chest, too. She could taste blood in her mouth. She had to get out. The pod was damaged beyond repair, smoke filling the small space. With her good arm, she hit the emergency release. The door hissed open and she stumbled out into the alien forest. Everything hurt. The gravity on this human world was slightly different from her home planet, making her feel heavy and clumsy. She looked around at the strange trees with their green leaves. On her world, the plants were silver and blue like her skin. This place felt wrong and dangerous. Zarakai tried to remember her training. She was a scout for the Veltari Empire, sent to gather information about human colonies. But her ship had been attacked by human fighters, and she had barely escaped in this emergency pod. Now she was trapped on enemy soil. She reached for her sidearm with her good hand. The weapon was still there, though she wasn't sure if it still worked after the crash. She needed to find shelter, tend to her wounds, and try to contact her people. But first, she had to survive. The sound of footsteps on dead leaves made her freeze. Someone was coming through the trees. Her training told her everything she needed to know about humans. They were cruel. They tortured prisoners. They showed no mercy to her people. She had heard the stories from other Veltari soldiers who had barely escaped human capture. A human male stepped into the clearing where her pod had crashed. He was shorter than her, with brown hair and kind-looking eyes. He wore simple work clothes and carried some kind of bag. He stopped when he saw her, his eyes wide with surprise. Zarakai tried to raise her weapon, but her broken arm wouldn't move right. Pain shot through her body and she nearly fell. The human said something in his language, but she didn't understand the words. All she could hear was the enemy tongue, the same language shouted by the pilots who had shot down her ship. The human raised his hands, showing his palms. He spoke again, his voice soft and calm. He took a slow step forward, then another. Zarakai backed away, her heart beating fast. This was it. This was when the torture would begin. She had heard what humans did to captured Veltari, but the human didn't attack. Instead, he pointed to her arm, then to the blood on her face. He made gestures that seemed to show concern. He reached into his bag and pulled out a white box with a red cross on it. Zarakai had never seen the symbol before, but somehow it didn't look threatening. The human knelt down and opened the box. Inside were bandages, bottles of liquid, and other medical supplies. He looked up at her and spoke again in that same gentle voice. Then he pointed to her wounds and to the supplies in the box. Zarakai didn't understand. Why wasn't he hurting her? Where were the restraints, the weapons, the torture devices she had been told about? This human was acting like he wanted to help her, but that was impossible. Humans didn't help Veltari. They were enemies. The human stood up slowly and took another careful step toward her. Zarakai wanted to run, but her body was too damaged. She was losing blood and her vision was getting blurry. If she tried to run now, she would probably die in these strange woods. The human spoke to her again, his voice even softer now. He held up a bandage and pointed to her bleeding forehead. Then he waited, not moving closer, just standing there with patience in his eyes. Zarakai had a choice. She could try to fight this human with her one good arm and probably die. She could try to run and definitely die from her injuries. Or she could trust that maybe, just maybe, not everything she had been told about humans was true. Her legs gave out, and she sank to the ground. The human immediately came forward, moving carefully like he was approaching a frightened animal. He knelt beside her and gently touched her shoulder. His touch was warm and surprisingly gentle. He began to work on her wounds. First, he cleaned the cut on her forehead with something that stung but seemed to help stop the bleeding. He put a bandage over it, his movements careful and practiced. Then he looked at her broken arm. The human said something and pointed to her arm, then made a gesture like he was straightening something out. Zarakai understood. He wanted to set the broken bone. She nodded, biting down on her lower lip to prepare for the pain. But when he worked on her arm, he was as gentle as possible. He moved slowly, watching her face for signs of too much pain. When she cried out, he stopped and waited for her to be ready before continuing. He wrapped the arm in a hard bandage that would keep it straight while it healed. As he worked, Zarakai studied his face. This human looked tired, like he had been working hard all day. His hands were rough from manual labor, but they were gentle as they tended her injuries. His eyes showed concern, not cruelty. Everything about him was different from what she had been taught to expect. When he finished with her arm, the human helped her to her feet. He pointed deeper into the forest and said something that sounded like a question. Then he made gestures that seemed to suggest he wanted to take her somewhere safe. Zarakai looked back at her ruined pod. She had no other choice. She was hurt, alone and stranded on an enemy world. This human could have left her to die or turned her over to his military. Instead, he was offering help. She nodded slowly. The human smiled, the first genuine smile she had ever seen from one of his kind. He put her good arm over his shoulder to support her weight and began to lead her through the forest. With each step, Zarakai wondered if she was making a terrible mistake or if everything she thought she knew about humans might be wrong. Jake Morrison had seen many injured people during his time as a combat medic, but never anything like this. The alien woman was tall and graceful despite her injuries, with skin that shimmered like moonlight on water. Her large eyes held pain and fear, but also intelligence. She was definitely Veltari, the enemy his people had been fighting for 3 years. But right now, she wasn't an enemy. She was just someone who needed help. Jake supported most of her weight as they walked through the forest toward his cabin. She was heavier than she looked, and he could feel her strength even though she was badly hurt. Every few steps she would tense up like she expected him to attack her. He tried to keep his movements calm and predictable. The walk took 20 minutes that felt like hours. By the time they reached his small wooden cabin, the alien woman was barely conscious. Jake helped her up the 3 steps to his front door and guided her inside. His cabin was simple but comfortable. One main room with a kitchen, living area, and his bed. A small bathroom was attached to the back. Jake had built most of it himself. When he first came to Haven's Edge Colony 5 years ago, he liked living away from the main settlement, alone in the quiet forest. Jake helped the alien woman to his bed. She looked around nervously, her large eyes taking in everything. When he gestured for her to lie down, she shook her head and tried to back away. She was afraid of being trapped or tied down. Instead, Jake pointed to a chair near the bed. She sat down carefully, keeping her good hand free in case she needed to defend herself. Jake could see the logic in her thinking. She was smart to stay cautious. He went to his medical supplies and brought back everything he would need. During his years as a medic, Jake had learned to treat many different kinds of injuries. He had even worked on captured Veltari soldiers. Before, though most had died from their wounds before he could save them, the alien woman watched him prepare his instruments. When he approached with a scanner, she pulled back. Jake realized she didn't know what it was. He turned the device toward himself first and ran it over his own arm, showing her the harmless green light it produced. Then he pointed to her chest where he suspected internal bleeding. She understood and allowed him to scan her. The results were not good. She had 2 broken ribs and bleeding in her abdomen. Without proper medical care, she would die within days. Jake's field supplies could help, but she needed surgery that he couldn't provide in his cabin. Jake looked at the results and made a decision that surprised even him. He could contact the colony medical center. They would send a transport and take her to the hospital, but they would also arrest her as a prisoner of war. He had heard what happened to Veltari prisoners. Most disappeared into military detention centers and were never seen again. Instead, Jake decided to treat her himself. He had done field surgery before when no other help was available. It was risky, but it was her only real chance at survival. He tried to explain what he needed to do, using simple gestures. He pointed to her chest, then to his surgical tools, then made cutting motions. Her eyes went wide with fear. She probably thought he was going to torture her. Jake set down his tools and went to his bookshelf. He found his old medical textbook and showed her pictures of the surgical procedure he needed to perform. Then he showed her the scanner results, on his portable screen pointing to the internal bleeding. The alien woman studied the images for a long time. Jake could see her thinking, weighing her options. She was smart enough to understand that she was dying and that he was offering to help, not hurt her. Finally, she nodded. Jake prepared everything carefully. He gave her local anesthetic to numb the pain, though he wasn't sure how it would affect her alien physiology. He worked slowly and carefully, making the smallest incision possible to repair the internal damage. Throughout the surgery, the alien woman stayed conscious. She watched him work with those large, intelligent eyes. Several times Jake looked up to see if she was in too much pain, but she remained still and calm. She was tougher than she looked. When he finished, Jake bandaged the incision and helped her lie down on his bed. She was exhausted from the surgery and blood loss. He brought her water and some simple food that he hoped her kind could digest. She drank the water gratefully but was cautious about the food. Jake tried a small piece first to show it was safe, then offered it to her. She ate slowly, testing each bite. Some things she could eat, others she pushed away. Jake made mental notes about what worked and what didn't. As night fell, the alien woman grew more nervous. Jake realized she was afraid of what might happen while she slept. In her mind, he might hurt her when she was helpless. Jake took his pillow and blanket and made a bed for himself on the floor near the door. He wanted to show her that he wouldn't take advantage of her while she recovered. The bed was hers until she was better. She watched him lie down on the hard floor and pull the thin blanket over himself. Jake could see confusion in her expression. This wasn't what she expected from a human captor. During the night, Jake woke several times to check on her condition. Each time he found her watching him with those luminous eyes. She barely slept, too afraid to let her guard down. But she was alive, and her vital signs were stable. On the second day, Jake had to go to work. He couldn't stay away too long or people would ask questions. Before leaving, he brought her more food and water and tried to explain through gestures that he would return. She looked terrified when she realized he was leaving. Jake understood why. Alone and injured in an enemy's house, she was completely helpless. If other humans came, she couldn't escape or defend herself. Jake went to his gun cabinet and did something that shocked even him. He took out a small pistol and placed it on the table beside the bed. Then he stepped back and raised his hands to show he was unarmed. The alien woman stared at the weapon, then at him. She couldn't understand why a human would give a gun to his enemy. But Jake had realized something important. If she was going to heal, she needed to feel safe. The gun would help her feel less helpless. He left for work knowing she could kill him when he returned. But somehow Jake didn't think she would. There had been something in her eyes when he helped her, a recognition that he meant no harm. When Jake came home that evening, he found her sitting up in bed with the gun beside her, unused. She had eaten some of the food he left and seemed stronger. Most importantly, she looked at him differently now. The terror was gone, replaced by curiosity. Jake smiled and began preparing dinner for both of them. For the first time since the crash, the alien woman almost smiled back. It was a small beginning, but it was enough. 3 days passed in careful routine. Each morning, Jake would check Zarakai's wounds before leaving for work. Each evening, he would return to find her a little stronger, a little less afraid. They communicated mostly through gestures and simple drawings, but slowly they began to understand each other. Jake learned that her name sounded like Zarakai when she pointed to herself and spoke carefully. She learned that he was called Jake when he did the same. It was a small thing, but having names made them feel less like enemies and more like two people sharing the same space. Zarakai watched Jake carefully during these first days. She noticed how he moved around the cabin with quiet efficiency. He would make breakfast for both of them, though he ate different foods than she could. He kept the cabin clean and comfortable. In the evenings, he would sit in his chair and read books by lamplight. She had expected a human's home to be full of weapons and military equipment. Instead, Jake's cabin felt peaceful. He had books about engineering and medicine, but also stories of adventure and exploration. There were pictures on the walls of beautiful landscapes from different worlds. No propaganda posters or hate symbols like she had been told all humans displayed. On the fourth day, Jake stayed home from work. Zarakai worried that something was wrong until she realized he was staying to take better care of her. Her internal injuries were healing, but she was still weak and needed help moving around. That morning, Jake brought out a small device with a screen. Zarakai tensed, thinking it might be a weapon or communication device that would bring more humans. Instead, Jake pointed to objects around the cabin and then typed words on the screen that appeared as text and spoken sounds. Chair, the device said in Jake's language when he pointed to the furniture. Water, it said when he held up a glass. Book, when he showed her one of his reading materials. Zarakai understood. This was a translation device, a way for them to learn each other's languages. Jake was trying to teach her human words, and he wanted to learn hers in return. She pointed to the chair and spoke the Veltari word, Thranal. Jake typed it into the device and repeated the sound carefully. His pronunciation was rough, but he was trying. When he said it almost correctly, Zarakai nodded encouragingly. They spent the morning teaching each other basic words: water, food, bed, door, hot, cold, yes, no, good, bad. Jake was a patient teacher, and Zarakai found herself enjoying the challenge of learning his language. It had been a long time since she had done anything that wasn't related to war or military duty. By afternoon, they could have simple conversations using a mixture of both languages and the translation device. Jake learned that Zarakai had been a scout, not a fighter. She explored new worlds and studied their plants and animals. She had only joined the military when the war started, and her people needed information about human colonies. Zarakai learned that Jake had been a combat medic during the early battles of the war. He had saved many lives, both human and Veltari, but he had grown tired of the fighting and come to Haven's Edge to help build something instead of destroy it. He maintained the colony's power systems and communication networks. Why help me? Zarakai asked in broken human words mixed with gestures. Jake was quiet for a long time before answering. You were hurt, he said simply. I help hurt people, always. That evening, Jake showed Zarakai something she didn't expect. He brought out a small photo album filled with pictures of wounded soldiers he had treated during the war. Some were humans, but many were Veltari. Under each picture, he had written notes about their injuries and recovery. Sevhan Krital. He read slowly from one page, trying to pronounce a Veltari name. Broken leg, plasma burns. Sent home to family. Zarakai looked at the pictures in amazement. She recognized some of the Veltari soldiers. They had been listed as missing in action, presumed dead. But here was proof that this human had saved them and helped them return to their people. You could have been rich, she said, using the translation device to make sure he understood. Veltari prisoners worth much money to humans. Jake shook his head. Not money, people, he said. Not enemies, just people far from home. That night, Zarakai had her first peaceful sleep since the crash. She had stopped clutching the pistol Jake had given her. She was beginning to trust that he really meant no harm. The next morning, Jake returned to work but left the translation device so Zarakai could practice. She spent the day learning new words and phrases. She also explored the cabin more carefully. Now that her strength was returning, she found Jake's medical certificates on the wall of his small bathroom. The documents showed he had received commendations for treating enemy wounded during battle. There was also a letter from a Veltari medical officer, thanking him for saving the lives of 3 scouts who had been captured after a skirmish. In Jake's bedroom, she found more personal items, photos of him with other humans who looked happy and peaceful. A letter from someone called Kate who wrote about teaching children at a school. Another letter from someone named Ryan, who had died during the war while trying to rescue wounded soldiers from both sides. Zarakai began to understand that Jake had lost friends and family to this war just as she had. But instead of letting it fill him with hatred, he had chosen to save lives whenever possible, even enemy lives, even her life. When Jake came home that evening, he found Zarakai sitting at his small table with the translation device and several pieces of paper covered in writing. She had been practicing writing in human letters. "I want to tell you about me," she said in careful human words. "My life before war." Jake sat down across from her and listened as Zarakai told him about her home world. She described the crystal cities that grew from the ground like living things, powered by the planet's twin suns. She told him about her family, her parents, who were researchers, her younger brother who had wanted to be an artist. "He made beautiful things," she said, her voice sad. "Drew pictures of birds that flew between the crystals. Wrote songs about the wind through the spires." She paused. "Human attack killed him. That's why I joined military. Wanted revenge." Jake nodded with understanding. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. "War takes good people." "Yes," Zarakai agreed. "Takes good people from both sides." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, each thinking about the losses they had suffered. Then Jake got up and made dinner for both of them, sharing the quiet work of cooking and eating together. As they cleaned up afterward, Zarakai realized something had changed between them. They were no longer captor and prisoner or even patient and doctor. They were beginning to become something she had never expected to have with a human. Friends. The thought should have frightened her. Everything she had been taught said it was impossible. But sitting in Jake's peaceful cabin, learning his language and sharing stories of their lives, it felt like the most natural thing in the world. 2 weeks had passed since the crash, and Zarakai could now move around Jake's cabin without pain. Her broken arm was healing well, and the internal injuries had stopped bleeding completely. She felt stronger each day, but with that strength came difficult questions about what would happen next. During the day while Jake worked, Zarakai had begun exploring his belongings more thoroughly. She wasn't spying exactly, but she was curious about this human who had saved her life. Everything she discovered challenged what she thought she knew about his people. In a drawer beneath his clothes, she found a collection of letters tied together, with string. They were from other people Jake had helped during the war. Some were from human soldiers thanking him for saving their lives, but many were from Veltari families, written in her own language. One letter was from the parents of Sevhan Krital, the soldier whose picture she had seen in Jake's medical album. They thanked him for healing their son and helping him return home safely. They said their family would always honor Jake's name and remember his kindness. Another letter was from a Veltari doctor who had worked with Jake during a brief ceasefire to treat wounded from both sides. The doctor wrote that Jake had shown him that humans could be honorable and compassionate, even in the middle of war. Zarakai sat on Jake's bed holding these letters, feeling her understanding of the universe shift around her. She had been taught that humans were monsters without mercy or honor. But here was proof that at least one human had risked his own safety many times to save Veltari lives. In Jake's bookshelf, she found journals he had kept during his time as a combat medic. The entries were written in simple, honest language that described the horrors of war from someone who spent his time trying to heal rather than kill. "Today I lost a young Veltari scout," one entry read. "Couldn't stop the bleeding in time. She was about Kate's age, maybe younger. Had a picture of her family in her pocket. I sent it back to her people with her personal effects. No one should die alone so far from home." Another entry described Jake's frustration with commanders on both sides who refused to allow medical evacuations during active fighting. "They see soldiers, not people," he had written. "But when you're trying to stop someone from bleeding to death, all that matters is saving a life. Enemy or friend doesn't matter when someone's dying in front of you." When Jake came home that evening, Zarakai was waiting for him with the letters and journals spread out on his table. She expected him to be angry that she had gone through his private things. Instead, he just looked tired. "You found my old stuff," he said quietly, sitting down across from her. "Why you keep these?" Zarakai asked, her human words much better now after 2 weeks of practice. "Why you save letters from Veltari people?" Jake picked up one of the letters and looked at it for a long moment. "To remember why I do this work," he said finally. "When the war makes everything seem hopeless, these letters remind me that there's still good in the universe, that people can be kind to each other, even when their governments tell them to hate." Zarakai held up the journal entry about the young Veltari scout who had died. "This girl, she could have been me," she said. "Yes," Jake nodded. "That's why I couldn't leave you to die in that crashed pod. Every person I couldn't save makes me more determined to save the next one." That night, Zarakai made a decision that would have seemed impossible 3 weeks ago. She told Jake about her own past, not just the happy memories of her homeworld, but the painful ones that had led her to war. She described the day her brother had died. He had been in their capital city when human bombers attacked. The military targets had been destroyed, but the bombs had also killed hundreds of civilians, including her gentle brother who had never hurt anyone in his life. "I was so angry," she said, the words coming easier now that she knew Jake would understand. "I wanted all humans to suffer like my family suffered. I joined the military to hurt your people any way I could." Jake listened without judgment as she described her training as a scout, her first missions to spy on human colonies, her growing skill at gathering intelligence that helped Veltari forces attack human settlements. "I was good at hating," she said quietly. "Made me feel strong, after feeling so helpless when my brother died." "Hatred is easy," Jake said. "It's simple and it makes you feel like you're doing something, but it doesn't bring back the people you lost." Zarakai looked at him with surprise. "How you know this?" Jake was quiet for a long time before answering. "Because I hated too," he said finally. "After my friend Ryan died trying to save wounded soldiers, I wanted revenge. I wanted to hurt every Veltari I saw. That's why I became a combat medic instead of staying safe behind the lines. I thought saving human lives and watching Veltari soldiers die would make me feel better." "But it didn't?" Zarakai asked. "No. The first time I watched a Veltari soldier bleed to death when I could have saved him, I realized that hatred was killing something inside me too. That soldier had a family somewhere, people who loved him. His death didn't bring Ryan back, it just made more people sad." Jake showed Zarakai a small device he wore around his neck. Inside was a holographic image of him with another young human man, both of them smiling in military uniforms. "This is Ryan," Jake said. "He always said that the only way to honor the dead is to save the living. After I let that first Veltari soldier die, I decided he was right. I started treating anyone who needed help no matter what side they were on." Zarakai reached into her clothing and pulled out her own small device. The hologram showed her with a slightly younger Veltari male who had silver markings on his face that indicated artistic talent. "This is Koreth, my brother," she said. "He would have liked you, I think. He believed all people are connected, that art and beauty belong to everyone, not just one species." They sat together looking at the images of their lost friends and family. For the first time, Zarakai truly understood that humans grieved their dead just like her people did. They felt loss and pain and the desire for revenge, but some of them, like Jake, chose to transform that pain into something healing instead of destructive. "What happens now?" Zarakai asked. "I am strong enough to leave, but I have nowhere to go. My ship is destroyed. My people think I am dead." Jake was quiet for a long time. "That's up to you," he said finally. "I could help you contact your people, or you could stay here until we figure out something else." "You would let me stay?" Zarakai asked with surprise. "Even though I am enemy?" Jake looked at her seriously. "Zarakai, you stopped being my enemy the day you chose to trust me instead of shooting me with that gun I gave you. Now you're just someone who needs help figuring out what comes next." That night, as Zarakai lay in Jake's bed while he slept on his makeshift bed on the floor, She thought about everything that had happened. 2 weeks ago, she would have killed any human without hesitation. Now she was beginning to care about this one human more than she had cared about anyone since her brother died. The realization should have frightened her. Instead, it felt like waking up from a long, dark dream. For the first time in years, Zarakai fell asleep, thinking about hope instead of revenge. 3 weeks after the crash, Jake's routine scanner picked up something that made his blood run cold. 3 Veltari ships were approaching Haven's Edge, moving in a search pattern. They were looking for something, and Jake had a terrible feeling. He knew what it was. He left work immediately and rushed back to his cabin. Zarakai was sitting at his table, practicing writing human letters. She looked up when he burst through the door, and immediately knew something was wrong. "Your people," Jake said breathlessly. "3 ships, they're searching for something." Zarakai's face went pale. She stood up quickly and went to the window, though the ships were too far away to see. "They look for me," she said quietly. "My ship was overdue to report back. They send rescue mission." Jake felt his heart pounding. This was the moment he had been dreading. Soon, Veltari soldiers would be on the ground looking for their missing scout. They would find the crash site and track her to his cabin. Everything he and Zarakai had built together over these past weeks would be over. "What do you want to do?" Jake asked. Zarakai turned away from the window and looked at him with those large, luminous eyes. For a moment, neither of them spoke. They both understood what was really being asked. Zarakai could signal the ships and be rescued by her own people. She would be safe, back among her own kind, away from this human world. But she would have to report everything she had learned about the colony. That was her duty as a scout. Jake could contact the Colonial Defense Force and report the Veltari ships. They would send fighters to drive them away or capture them. But that would mean revealing that he had been hiding an enemy scout for 3 weeks. He would probably face charges for treason, or they could do nothing and hope the search party didn't find them. But that seemed impossible given how thoroughly the Veltari were searching. "I don't know," Zarakai said finally. "I don't know what I want?" Jake understood her confusion. 3 weeks ago, her choice would have been simple: signal her people, report on the human colony, continue fighting the war. But now everything was complicated by the friendship they had built, the trust they shared, the way they had learned to see each other as individuals rather than enemies. An hour later, Jake's scanner showed that one of the Veltari ships had landed near the crash site. Soon they would find the trail leading to his cabin. There wasn't much time left. "Zarakai," Jake said carefully, "whatever you decide, I want you to know that these have been the best 3 weeks I've had since the war started. You made me remember why I became a medic in the first place." Zarakai looked at him with tears in her large eyes. "You saved my life, not just from injuries. You saved me from hatred. Before I met you, I was becoming someone I didn't recognize, someone my brother would have been ashamed of." The sound of aircraft approaching made them both look toward the window. Jake could see 2 Veltari shuttles flying low over the forest, following the path from the crash site. They would be here in minutes. Zarakai stood up and walked to where Jake kept her pistol. She picked it up and checked that it was loaded. For a moment, Jake thought she was going to shoot him. Instead, she handed the weapon back to him. "I cannot let them hurt you," she said. "You are best human I have ever known. Maybe best person." Jake shook his head and pushed the gun away. "I won't shoot your people either. There has to be another way." The shuttles landed in the clearing outside Jake's cabin with a whine of engines and a blast of displaced air. Through the window, they could see Veltari soldiers emerging from the craft, weapons ready. One of them was obviously an officer, taller than the others with more ornate markings on his armor. "That is my cousin Kethmore," Zarakai whispered. "He leads the search mission." The soldiers spread out around the cabin, taking defensive positions. The officer approached the front door alone and called out in the Veltari language. Zarakai translated quietly. "He says he knows I am here. He wants to talk." Zarakai looked at Jake one more time. In that look, he could see her making her decision. She walked to the door and opened it, stepping outside with her hands visible and empty. Jake followed her, staying close but not interfering. This was her choice to make. Kethamor spoke rapidly in Veltari, his voice showing relief and concern. Zarakai answered in the same language, her tone careful and controlled. Jake couldn't understand the words, but he could read the body language. The officer was asking questions, and Zarakai was choosing her answers very carefully. Finally, Kethmore looked at Jake. He spoke in accented but clear human language. "You are the one who found my cousin?" "Yes," Jake said simply. "You have kept her alive for 3 weeks?" "I helped her heal from her injuries." Kethmore studied Jake for a long moment, his eyes unreadable. Then he spoke to Zarakai again in Veltari. This conversation was longer and more intense. At one point, Kethmore gestured toward the colony in the distance and made what sounded like questions. Zarakai's answers were firm and definitive. Finally, the conversation ended. Kethmore turned back to Jake. "My cousin tells me you are a medic who has saved many Veltari lives during this war," he said. "She says you treated her injuries and asked for nothing in return." Jake nodded. "She was hurt. I help hurt people." "She also tells me something very interesting," Kethmore continued. "She says she was unconscious for many days after the crash and only recently became aware of her surroundings. She says you have been caring for her without knowing she could understand you." Jake glanced at Zarakai, understanding what she had done. She was giving him protection by claiming she had been unconscious during most of her time here. That way, he couldn't be accused of interrogating her or gathering intelligence, but Kethmore wasn't finished. "My cousin has requested something unusual. She wishes to remain on this world as an observer, to study human behavior and determine if there are opportunities for our peoples to understand each other better." Jake felt his heart skip. Zarakai had found a way to stay, to continue what they had started together. "This is highly irregular," Kethmore continued. "But my cousin is a valued scout, and her judgment has always been sound. If she believes there is value in this mission, I will support her request." He looked directly at Jake. "Will you continue to provide assistance to my cousin while she conducts this research?" Jake looked at Zarakai, who was watching him with hope and fear in her expression. "Yes," he said without hesitation. "I will help her with anything she needs." Kethamor nodded slowly. "Very well. But understand this, human. If any harm comes to my cousin, this entire colony will pay the price." "Understood," Jake said. The Veltari officer spoke to his soldiers, who began returning to their shuttles. Before leaving, he embraced Zarakai and spoke to her quietly in their own language. Jake could see the family affection between them, despite the military formality. As the shuttles lifted off and disappeared into the sky, Jake and Zarakai stood together in the clearing outside his cabin. They had both made choices that would change their lives forever. "So," Jake said as the sound of the engines faded away, "what do we do now?" Zarakai looked at him with a smile that transformed her entire face. "Now we try to build peace between our peoples, one friendship at a time." 6 months had passed since the Veltari rescue mission, and the small clearing behind Jake's cabin had been transformed into something neither species had seen before. A place where former enemies worked together in peace. Zarakai had kept her, promised to serve as an observer and liaison between her people and the human colony. She had established a small communication post in a building Jake helped her construct near his cabin. From there, she maintained regular contact with Veltari Command, while also working with the colony leadership to prevent misunderstandings that could lead to conflict. The work was not easy. Both sides remained suspicious and afraid. Many humans still saw Zarakai as a dangerous enemy who should not be trusted. Many Veltari thought she was betraying her people by working with humans, but slowly, carefully, she and Jake had begun to build bridges between the two species. It started with small things. When a Veltari patrol ship had technical problems near Haven's Edge, Zarakai convinced both sides to allow human mechanics to help with repairs. When human miners were trapped in a cave collapse, she arranged for Veltari rescue equipment to assist in the operation. Each successful cooperation made the next one a little easier. People on both sides began to see that their enemies were not the monsters they had been told about. They were just people trying to survive in a dangerous universe. Jake continued his work maintaining the colony's infrastructure, but now he often had Zarakai's help. Her technical knowledge from her scouting missions proved valuable in improving the settlement's power and communication systems. Working together, they made the colony more efficient and safer for everyone. In the evenings, they would sit together in Jake's cabin and plan their next project. Sometimes it was technical work like upgrading the medical center's equipment. Sometimes it was diplomatic work like arranging prisoner exchanges or negotiating local ceasefires. Always, it was about finding ways for humans and Veltari to see each other as people instead of enemies. The council approved our proposal, Zarakai said one evening as she reviewed messages from both governments on her communication device. Both sides agreed to the joint medical training program. Jake looked up from the book he was reading, a manual on Veltari biology that Zarakai had requested from her people. Really? They're going to let human and Veltari medics work together? Small. Group first, Zarakai said, her human speech now completely fluent after months of practice.
5 from each side. They will train here at Haven's Edge, learn to treat injuries for both species. It was a bigger breakthrough than it might sound. For the first time since the war began, members of both militaries would work together for
healing instead of fighting. The program would show soldiers from both sides that their enemies could be trusted partners in saving lives. Jake smiled as he imagined young medics from both species learning together, sharing techniques and knowledge. Your cousin Kethmore agreed to this? He said if his little cousin can learn to trust humans, maybe others can too, Zarakai said with a laugh. I think you impressed him when we first met. Over the months, Zarakai had told Jake more about her family. Kethmore was not just her cousin, but also her closest friend, almost like an older brother. He had been the one to encourage her artistic talents when they were young, before the war changed everything. His support for her work on Haven's Edge carried weight with other Veltari commanders. What about the agricultural exchange? Jake asked. Any word on that? Zarakai's expression became more serious. Still resistance from both sides. Too much fear that sharing food production technology could be used as a weapon. Jake nodded with understanding. Food security was a life and death issue for any colony or settlement. Both sides worried that sharing agricultural knowledge could give their enemies the ability to poison crops or create famines. It would take more time and trust building before such cooperation was possible. But they had other successes to celebrate. The prisoner exchange program they had helped establish had reunited dozens of families with loved ones who had been missing for years. The joint search and rescue protocols had saved lives when colonists or patrol crews went missing in dangerous areas of space. Most importantly, the fighting near Haven's Edge had stopped almost completely. Both sides had agreed that the area around Zarakai's communication post would be neutral territory, a place where disputes could be discussed instead of fought. I have news from my government, Zarakai said, setting down her communication device and turning to face Jake fully. They are offering me a promotion to full diplomatic status. I would become the first official Veltari ambassador to human territory. Jake felt his heart skip a beat. That's incredible, Zarakai. You've earned it. But, she continued, I would have to relocate to the main human diplomatic center on New Geneva. Leave Haven's Edge. Jake tried to keep his expression neutral, but Zarakai knew him well enough to see his disappointment. Over the months, they had become more than friends and partners in their peace work. They had become family to each other, filling the empty spaces left by the loved ones they had lost. To war, what do you want to do? Jake asked, echoing the same question he had asked her on the day her cousin found them. Zarakai was quiet for a long time, looking out the window at the communication post they had built together, the garden they had planted with earth and Veltari crops growing side by side. I want to stay here, she said finally. The real work happens at the local level between individuals. Big diplomats make treaties, but people like us make peace. Jake felt relief flood through him. Are you sure? This is a huge opportunity. I'm sure, Zarakai said firmly. Besides, someone needs to run the medical training program and the agricultural research project we're planning. And she smiled at him with that expression that never failed to warm his heart. Someone needs to make sure you don't work yourself to death maintaining this entire colony by yourself. That weekend, Jake and Zarakai worked together in the garden behind his cabin. They had expanded it over the months to include plants from both their worlds. Some grew well together, others needed to be separated, but with patience and experimentation they had created something beautiful and productive. As they worked in the rich soil, planting seeds that would grow into food for both humans and Veltari, Jake thought about how much had changed since that day 6 months ago, when he had found a crashed enemy scout in the forest. The war continued in other parts of the galaxy, but here in this small corner of space, 2 former enemies had proven that understanding was possible. They had shown that people who had been taught to hate each other could choose compassion instead. Jake, Zarakai said as they finished planting the last row of seeds. Do you think we are making a real difference? Jake looked around at everything they had accomplished. The communication post that prevented conflicts through dialogue. The joint programs that showed both species they could work together. The garden where plants from 2 worlds grew in harmony. I think, Jake said carefully, that every person we convince to see their enemies as people instead of monsters makes the universe a little safer. Every life we save, every prisoner we reunite with their family, every young medic we train to heal instead of kill, it all matters. Zarakai placed her hand over his as they knelt beside the newly planted seeds. Her skin was still silver blue, and his was still human pink, but their touch was warm and familiar and full of shared hope. My brother would be proud of what we have built here, she said quietly. Ryan would be too, Jake agreed. He always said the best way to honor the dead is to save the living. As the sun set over Haven's Edge, casting long shadows across their garden, Jake and Zarakai sat together on the steps of his cabin. Tomorrow there would be more work to do, more bridges to build, more people to convince that peace was possible. But tonight, they could rest in the knowledge that they had planted seeds of understanding that would continue to grow long after the war ended. In a universe full of conflict and hatred, they had created a small space where kindness could flourish. And sometimes, Jake thought as he watched the stars appear in the darkening sky, that was how peace really began. Not with grand treaties or dramatic gestures, but with 2 people choosing to see the best in each other instead of the worst. The garden would need tending, but the seeds they had planted together would grow.